Hi, I'm Carlo Rotella. I'm the director of the Lowell Humanities series. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to let you know about our next speaker, which will be the poet Laura Kaziski on November 5th in this room at 7 p.m. I also want to remind you to please turn off cell phones and laptops and other devices with screens and that make noise. And I'll also note that after the talk today, there will be Q&A for a while, and then there'll be a book signing up here, and books are for sale there in the back of the room. So, I first met Stuart Dybek at the Berghof, an old German restaurant in Chicago's Loop. This was long enough ago that his son, Nick, who's now an accomplished novelist in his own right, was just a little boy who played quietly at the table, while Stuart talked about the ways that we emerge from and return to our old neighborhoods in life and in literature. Walking down the street away from the Berghof afterward, I found myself filled not only with meat and beer, but also with a fresh sense of purpose and inspiration. I was thinking, you know what? I can write this book that I'm struggling to write, and it's worth doing because to be a member of the tribe of readers and writers is a great thing because life is filled with beauty and mystery. And I've come to recognize this as my standard, typical response to any encounter with Stuart on the page or in person. Over the years since then, I've come back to him for fresh doses of wisdom and inspiration. One of the most important things I've learned from him has to do with mystery. He once said of another writer we were talking about that she was abundantly talented, but suffered from the handicap of knowing what everything in her books means. I took that to heart and learned to value the quality of mystery in all kinds of writing, fiction and nonfiction. Mystery in the sense that the world is not orderly and the project of imposing meaning on it is necessarily partial and unfinished and open-ended and doomed to fall short. And most of the beauty comes in the falling short. I learn all kinds of things from reading Stuart. He has an early poem entitled "To Acquire a Beautiful Body," and it begins like this. Live alone in a room where the windows are painted stuck. Old salmon paint that reminds you of those who were beautiful when you were a child. They were still young when this paint was slapped on creamy over dust. They saw streetcars in the traffic out the window. The war was over. Now you are as old. And then the way that you acquire a beautiful body, the poem goes on to explain, is this. You continue to heave upward, fists knurled through handles, straining at the stuck window. Every time I read that poem, I think it's all in there somewhere, the blueprint for living and the elegant refutation of the blueprint for living. And I'm about to find out the secret. And then I think, oh wait, there's a secret inside the secret. And so I come back to the poem, and I come back again and again, and I realize that the poem has become one of my old neighborhoods, part of where I'm from. And I wonder how that happened, so I read more of his work to try to figure it out, and my old neighborhood gets deeper and more complex and more mysterious and more beautiful. Stuart Dybek is the author of 5 books of fiction, including Childhood and Other Neighborhoods, Coast of Chicago, I Sailed with Magellan, Ecstatic, Cahoots, and Paper Lantern, the last 2 both published this June. He's also published 2 volumes of poetry, Brass Knuckles and Streets in Their Own Ink. His work is widely anthologized and translated and has been showered with literary awards, including the Penn Bernard Malamud Prize, a Lannan Award, the Academy Institute Award in Fiction from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Whiting Writers Award, 2 fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, 4 O. Henry Prizes, and a Genius Grant from the MacArthur Foundation. He currently teaches at Northwestern University, where he is Distinguished Writer in Residence. Please join me in welcoming Stuart Dybek to BC.
Thanks for coming on such a rainy night. I'm really happy to be here. One of the perks of writing that nobody tells you when you're young is the friendships, and Carlos' friendship is very dear to me. I thought what I'd do would be talk a little bit about the pieces that I'm going to read. I had 2 books come out at the same time in this last June. And up to that time, all the books of fiction that I did, I think like most writers, even though they're collections rather than, say, novels, you kind of look for some organizing principle, and for me it was an easy one. I just organized them around place. In fact, when I met Carlo, he was writing a book on urban writers, and the place I organized it around was Chicago, where I grew up. But over the years, I accumulated manuscripts that didn't fit in those books, and suddenly realized I had at least 2 book-length manuscripts. And one of them is called Paper Lantern, and they're longer, slightly more conventional stories, and I kind of organized them around the idea of a love story in the broadest sense of the word. The other book that I'm going to read from is called Ecstatic Cahoots, a title I got from Scott Fitzgerald. It's in Great Gatsby. And I organized that one around little forms that I had written all the way from back in high school. I never had a name for them. I don't even know where I got the idea to write these little short pieces. And when you write them, what you do is you look for other people who are writing like things. And at first, the only other like things that I found were prose poems. So I called what I was writing prose poems. And in fact, the piece that Carlo read, which I hardly remember, I think it was a prose poem. And the only editors who would publish prose that short were prose poem editors. So by calling them prose poems, it helped you get them published. So I'm going to read. So when I put this book together, what I did was I just got all these little short pieces and I jammed them together. But they operate in different ways. So some of them operate like prose poems. Some of them operate kind of like one-line jokes. Some of them operate kind of like more conventional stories. But when you think about stories operate in different ways. Sometimes for me, one way that I can sort the way a story operates is by its ending, how it ends. Hopefully what you're trying to do is satisfy the reader in some way. So some stories end in the way that tales end. Tales end, the good guy gets the girl, or the good girl gets the guy, and evil is punished, and the world is saved, whether it's by some mythic hero or by James Bond. Whatever is going on is of world consequence. And the tale is still with us. Usually the tale is amazing things happen, sometimes magical things. Modern literature kind of takes a different path. For instance, one of the probably, maybe in some ways, the most seminal modern writer for the short story is Chekhov. And the way Chekhov changed if you can change the ending, if you can change how a reader feels a story actually ends, you change literature. It sounds like an easy thing to do. And if you think you have a way to do it, you can join the pantheon of the writers I'm about to talk about. So number one would be Chekhov. Chekhov began to create stories that could end with a realization. Nobody had to be killed. Nobody had to go to jail. Nobody had to fall in love. Nobody had to get married. Nobody had to do any of those things. All you had to do was say, and then I realized. And in fact, it's reached a point where writers are writing, I will never write an ending that begins with those words. But the realization ending is still really with us. And one of the reasons that was such a significant ending is that it absolutely opened writing up for women writers. When writing was totally dependent upon the tale, and it had sword fights and gun fights and car chases and everything that we still have today, It didn't allow for the stories that could take place in where women writers in the 19th century were spending a lot of time in the kitchen. It didn't allow for stories that could take place in the nursery. As soon as you change it to a realization, you can tell a story about anything. A person can be disabled, a person can be and living in a hospital, a person can be elderly and living in some elderly place. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to have that kind of magical stuff going on, which is very male-oriented frequently. Poe was a writer I loved as a kid. And as I grew older, kind of lost my taste for him, but got him again through the French, where Poe is really a greater French writer than he is an American writer because they've made him one. And it might even happen, and I got him back through the French. It might even happen someday with Jerry Lewis, I don't know, but it hasn't yet. But it did happen with Poe, and the thing that Poe brought into literature is the idea that a story could end with an effect. That was his word. What the French call it is a frisson, a shiver. In other words, it doesn't have to end with a great realization. It doesn't have to end with everything put back in balance, the karmic world reorganized, or anything like that. If it just gives you that shiver, and of course the kind of shiver Poe wants to give you is one that's very suitable for our upcoming feast of Halloween. But it doesn't have to be horror or, and you can really see with Kafka, how Kafka took that sense of effect and did a lot more with it. So there's that. And then Joyce and Virginia Woolf and other writers of that kind, building on the idea of realization, come up with the idea of epiphany. And I think that's really, in some ways, as far as we've gotten. There have been all kinds of attempts to change things up again over the second part of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. But going back to what I just said, I don't really think that, so far as I know, that some kind of an ending has come along that's so seminal that writers are, for instance, John Fowles with his two endings for The French Lieutenant's Woman, you could see a really gifted writer trying to work that idea out. How can I change the story by changing the target of the story? Anyway, I use this book as a kind of little testing ground maybe, or a way of just playing with the whole notion of what a story is. All the pieces are very small, are very short. The going phrase for it now is not prose poem. Not that prose poems aren't still around, but flash fiction. It's not a name that I particularly fond of. I don't have another one to suggest. They used to be called short shorts. People didn't like that either. Grace Paley once said to me, "It sounds more like a stammer than a literary form." So I'm going to read a couple of these things. Here's one that's called The Story of Mist, if I could find it. That's well, I can't, so I'm going to read Drive. It's popping right up. Highly influenced by the prose poem. Lost. The hot pink bullet from the spent cartridge of lip gloss found lodged between gearbox and seat. And the beach he always caught, chasing from station to station as they raced between red lights. The scent of summer evaporating at noon, coconut, sweat, the salt lick of her skin scorched against turquoise vinyl. Evening's perfume of broken heat, a tide of lawn sprinklers whipping through the dark as moons emerge, each neighborhood, each roof, each window pane, sending up its own. In the smaze of foundry chimneys, a tarnished spoon bent by telekinesis into a wedding band. Over a steeple, a halo, missing a saint. Above the shimmering Sweetwater Sea, a tragic mask with a comic reflection. Or is it vice versa? There's one unself-conscious about its pitted face, one with its own star in Hollywood, and another aloof, back turned as if boycotting tomorrow, the way Miles Davis, circa Kinda Blue, would turn his back on the audience when he'd solo. And in the rear view mirror where it's always October, leaves blowing off like pages from an unfinished memoir. So where to, she'd ask. Baby, just drive. So, you know, the ending there is a couple of lines of dialogue, and what you hope as you're writing is that you're accumulating all these kinds of lyric lines like a poem that are going to play off that last ending. Another thing that's always, that comes in small doses are jokes. There was the premier prose poet for the longest time, I don't know if any of you have ever read him, is a guy named Russell Edson. His father was a famous cartoonist way back who wrote a cartoon called Andy Cap that was syndicated. And Russell kind of was a cartoonist of the prose poem. I invited him to read one day at the school where I was teaching because I loved his work so much. And I told him that one of the things I loved about it was it reminded me of jokes. He got really pissed off. He thought I was insulting him, I don't know. So a joke's got a punchline, right? So that I am not insulted if a piece comes close to a joke. I think that's a great thing. But a punchline is a kind of an ending. So this piece is called Confession. Father Boguslaw was the priest I always waited for, the one whose breath through the thin partition of the confessional reminded me of the ventilator behind Vic's tap. He huffed and smacked as if in response to my dull litany of sins, and I pictured him slouched in his cubicle, draped in vestments, the way he sat slumped in the back entrance of the sacristy on cold mornings before saying morning mass, hungover, sucking an unlit Pall Mall, exhaling smoke. Once his head thudded against the wooden box. "Father," I whispered, "Father." But he was out, snoring. I knelt wondering what to do until he finally groaned and hacked himself awake. As usual, I'd saved the deadly sins for last, the lies and copied homework, snitching drinks, ditching school, hitchhiking, which I'd been convinced was an offense against the fifth commandment, which prohibited suicide. Before I reached the dirty snapshots of Korean girls, stolen from the dresser of my war hero, Uncle Al, and still unrepentantly catched behind the oil shed. Father B knocked and said I was forgiven. As for penance, go in peace, my son. I'm suffering enough today for both of us. As you get into slightly longer stories, the punchline, the kind of prose poemy thing, at least in my experience, doesn't sustain the piece. A lot of them are just to get in and get out as fast as you can. One of the things that I wondered about was how short can you really go and still call it a story? So I'm going to read you the shortest piece in the book. But it's really short. You have to listen because it'll be gone before you start listening. And then I'm going to finish with a more conventional length story that's still relatively short. This is called Mysterioso. And I'll also add, since I'm just kind of chanting with you, that people sometimes wonder, once they're in a book, are you done with them? And hopefully you are. But this one, I suddenly realized I screwed up. If I'd had it to do over again, I would have written it differently. And so every time I look at it, I curse it. All right, Mysterioso. Wait, I'm going to help you out. Mysterioso. It's 2 lines of dialogue. You're going to leave your watch on? You're leaving on your cross? No? All right, tea ceremony. When I found this one in an envelope. I'd forgotten I'd written it. I don't even remember when I wrote it, but I know I must have written it. I don't have other people's stories in my envelopes. I wish that would happen again. It's a lot easier to write them that way. This one has, you'll know it when you hear it. It has a Twilight Zone moment in it, where they play that music. The tentative first snow has become a ticking sleet that, despite the bone show, looks molten in the streetlights. Their shoes, his high tops, her purple suede boots, are soaked from the quest he's led them on, up one slushy block and down another, since they were asked to leave the movie theater. Are we lost yet? Gwen asks. Nothing looks the same in the snow. I swear there's this neat coffee house with a wood stove around here, Rick says. I found it by smell the last time. If it's someplace you used to go with Haley, let's forget it. Being there would feel creepy to me, Gwen says. You think I drag us around freezing because I'm looking for a place I'd been with someone else? You're right. You wouldn't want to violate the sacred memory. Geez, you're in a shitty mood. If you think it's my fault getting us kicked out, I apologize. I was in a great mood. What's more romantic than getting 86th for public lewdness and stepping into the first snow of the year? I loved walking in it together. Who drew a snow heart on the window of a car, and who walked away before we could write in our initials? Sorry, I was freezing. I'm not dressed for this. I need to keep moving, Rick says. Look, there's something open. We're saved. The restaurant's windows are steamed opaque. Inside, an illegible sign diffuses pink neon across a slick plate glass window and the Formica counter. There's a scorched, greasy griddle smell. The few customers at the counter, all men, eat with their coats on. Beyond the counter are 4 empty Formica tables. I want to go on record that I have never been in this place before, Rick says, nor will I ever be in this place again with anyone but you. You say that now. I'd never be able to find the place again if I wanted to. How about by smell? They sit at the table farthest from the counter and wedge their chairs together to study the plastic menu. Gwen opens her Goodwill fur coat and Rick unbuttons his Levi's jacket. But like the people at the counter, they eat with their coats on. An overweight waitress in a food-stained white uniform, her face ruddy with broken capillaries, shuffles over on swollen legs to take their order. The waitress waits, regarding them through eyes outlined in tarry mascara. Sandra is stitched in red on her uniform above the droop of her considerable bosom. You kids need more time? I think I'll have hot tea instead of coffee, Gwen tells Rick. Can I just get a tea, she asks the waitress. Sure can, hon, Sandra says. Tea sounds right for the weather, Rick says. This may be another first. I don't think I've ever ordered tea in a restaurant. What about a Chinese restaurant, Gwen asks. It doesn't count, Rick says. You don't order, it just comes. So 2 teas, the waitress asks. 2 hot teas. That it? Nothing to eat? Crumpets, maybe, Rick says. Do you have crumpets? Waitress isn't amused. Just the tea, please, Gwen tells her. You got it, hun, the waitress says, and writes down the order on her pad. You want cream or lemon? Lemon, Gwen says. I'd love some lemon. Lemon for me too, Rick says. Waitress writes it down. How about some honey, the waitress asks her. We got these little breakfast honeys for toast I could bring you? Thank you so much, Gwen says, smiling at Sandra. Just lemon's fine. She an old friend of yours, hun? A long-lost aunt or maybe a fairy godmother, Rick asks, after the waitress shuffles off. She's just being nice. She seems lonely. She's probably the only woman in here for most of the time. Maybe I reminded her of someone. Reminded her of who? How should I know? A daughter she never had, or when she did, a love child who ran away from home, and every time the door opens, Sandra thinks it might be her prodigal finally coming back. That would explain why she doesn't consider me a worthy escort. You notice the evil eye I was getting. Maybe she could see I'd been crying. Can you tell? You look like you just came in from the cold. Gwen polishes a teaspoon with a paper napkin and examines her reflection in the concave finish. My eyes are puffy. Rick takes the spoon from her, brings it to his lip as if it's brimming with steaming soup, and sips. I love the taste of your reflection, he says, dropping his voice. I could lick it off mirrors. A little over the top, but better. You're making a comeback, Gwen says, and takes his hand and slides it into the pocket of her fur coat. The strapless bra that Rick undid in the movie theater is still balled in the pocket. The pocket has a hole in it, and Rick can reach through the pocket and then through the torn lining of the coat to brush his fingers along Gwen's right breast. Uh-oh, Rick says. This is how it started in the movie theater. God, I was so close too, she says. I blame it on that old atmospheric theater and its velvet seats and winking starry sky, like we'd entered a time machine to get there, the way the movies used to be. I always envy those generations that grew up making out in drive-ins instead of ordering Netflix. I wanted us to come together while Fred and Ginger were dancing. Foreplay interrupt us, Rick says. We're both probably suffering from post-traumatic sex disruption. No wonder you got upset about a heart on a car window. It wasn't just a car. It was a vintage Jaguar. That was the point, a beautiful, sleek green Jag inscribed with a heart. Tomorrow morning, some lonely venture capitalist is going to come out and find that heart on his car and see only my initials because you were freezing and couldn't wait around. He'll think it was a message for him and inscribe his initials where yours were supposed to be. And then he'll slowly cruise through the city, hoping for G loves blank space. Whoever she is will wave as he goes by. Sandra brings a plastic tray to their table. Arranged on the tray are 2 small metal pots filled with steaming water and 2 thick white chip cups on matching chip saucers. There are 2 Salada tea packets on a separate plate, 2 spoons and a little white bowl of lemon wedges. She carefully transfers each of them to the table, setting the cup, pot, and spoon before each of them, and the bowl of lemon wedges in the middle. She opens the tea packets and places a tea bag in each cup, and then from her apron pocket produces 2 small containers of honey. Anything more I can get you? Sandra asks. This is wonderful, Gwen says. I wasn't expecting a tea ceremony when I ordered. Sandra smiles, pleased. It's just tea bag, she says. My mother really knew how to brew tea. Real loose tea from India, and a little silver ball with a chain. She could read the leaves. Really, Gwen says. I always wanted to see someone do that. My mother told me my Nonna Marie used to read the cards. Not tarot, just regular playing cards. The family story is that it was the cards that told my grandmother her future was in America. I read the cards, Sandra says. It's in my family. All the women can do it. My sister Irene can read eggs. Don't laugh, she says to Rick. It's true. I read palms. Who taught you, Gwen asks. Or did you, just know? My mother taught me. She taught me what I already knew but didn't have the confidence for. I can show you, Sandra says, and sits down at their table. She extends her hand towards Gwen, and Gwen releases Rick's hand in the pocket of her fur coat and gives her hand to Sandra. It's amazing what we're born knowing if someone just shows us, Gwen says. Yeah, and it's amazing what we think we know, and what we know is nothing, Sandra says. You have a warm, lovely hand, hon. She turns Gwen's hand palm up and lightly traces the lines with her crooked finger, studying them, and then looking up at Gwen, who meets Sandra's eyes and smiles. Sandra doesn't smile back. You're laughing on the outside, but your heart is crying, Sandra says. Rick feels caught off guard. He notices Gwen flinch and instinctively draw back, but Sandra grips her wrist. Gwen closes her hand, and Sandra gently pries it back open, studies it again. You too. You're the wrong chemicals to mix, she says, and shakes her head disapprovingly. Pardon, Gwen says? Not a good fit. No balance. Don't go near the ledge together, Sandra says. Pushes herself up as if she's suddenly weary and shuffles away. Mondo weirdo, Rick says. There goes her tip. I think we just experienced the gypsy tea ceremony. That line about crying in your heart sounds like it comes out of fortune telling for dummies. He pours hot water over his tea bag. The water in the cup turns tannic. My great aunt Lucille used to look like she was reading tea bags, he tells Gwen. She'd put a hot tea bag on her eyes when she had a migraine. She could tell the future from spatters of bacon fat, too, and could forecast winners at the track from feeling the fuzz on a raspberry. He sips his tea. The water that appeared to be hot is tepid. Gwen reaches for the glass container of sugar that huddles together with the salt and pepper shakers, a squeezed bottle of mustard, a bottle of Tabasco, and a clotted bottle of ketchup missing its cap around a napkin dispenser, like a little village rising from a Formica plain. Did you and your friends ever fill the sugar container with salt when you were in high school, Rick asks. What a callow guy thing to do, Gwen says. She stops before pouring sugar into her cup and instead touches the tip of her index finger to the sugar spout and then extends the sugary finger toward Rick. Taste. Some gang of knuckleheads like your high school homies might have been here messing around. It's sweet, Rick says. He licks the grains from her finger, then spreads her middle and forefinger as if spreading her legs, and runs his tongue down the side of her forefinger to the webbing and laps her there. She takes his hand, sprinkles sugar on his forefinger, guides it to her lips, and sucks it. He closes his eyes. Did you like it in the movie theater? Gwen asks. I loved it. I'm sorry we got kicked out and into the cold before we found out if we could get off, before Fred at least got a kiss from Ginger. What if going to that old theater was going back in time? And because we got kicked out, instead of staying until it was over and returning to the present, we were kicked out into the past. I mean, look at this place. Think about outside, how nothing looked the same. Gwen releases his hand, bobs her teacup bag into cup. The string slips from the staple and attaches to the bag of salata. And she spoons the tea bag out and presses it to her eye. Ooh, that feels good. Great Aunt Lucille was onto something. Gwen places the tea bag on her saucer and then sprinkles sugar on the lemon wedges in the bowl. I like tart tastes. I used to suck lemons when I was a little kid. My friends all thought I was crazy. I like how clean they make my mouth feel. She sucks at a lemon wedge and then inserts the wedge into her mouth and retracts her lips, giving Rick a lemon peel smile. He peels open a honey container and dabs a finger of honey and outlines her lips and kisses her. The lemon wedge, still in her mouth, blocks the probing of his tongue. His kiss tastes of lemon oil. He dabs his forefinger in the honey again and then slips his hand beneath the table and carefully slides it between the folds of her fur coat and up and under her heather woolen skirt. When he reaches her thighs, her legs part. She looks at him and narrows her eyes. There's the tink of her spoon as her right hand absently stirs her tea. So you think like maybe we're stranded in the past together, Rick asks. The lemon peel smiles back at him from between her lips. The lemon peel smiles back from him between her lips. The radiant warmth of her body defies the grains of ice, slashing through the dark trees that line the curb. The sleet ticking against the pinkish plate glass window and pocking the film of snow on the windshields of parked cars. No way would that heart on the jag survive until morning. She slouches down in her chair, pressing his sticky fingertip against her panties, and then past the elastic, so that the honey mixes with her slickness. They may have entered the past, but for this moment, there's only the present between them. From behind the counter, Sandra locks them in a non-stop stare. With his free hand, Rick raises his teacup to his lips. Gwen's eyes are closed. She's breathing heavier, nostrils flared, and her lips parted, revealing a silent lemon yellow sigh. When she slides towards his finger so that it enters, Rick whispers, "We can't let on that we're from the future. They don't want our kind here, sweetheart. You have to at least make like you're sipping your tea."